Hey everyone, my name is Jonathan Ritchie. Welcome back to another episode of Room Schoolhouse. We have a special guest here. You might recognize him. His name's David Barton. Have you ever done anything like this before?
I was actually walking by on the street and somebody asked me if I wanted to do it, and I thought I'd come see what you do.
Well, we're glad that you're here. We have a really special program for y'all today because today is December 7th, and it's actually the 80th anniversary of the attacks on Pearl Harbor. Now, America was actually still a neutral power at that point in the war, but the bombings on Pearl Harbor led to the sinking or significant damage of several of our biggest battleships. In fact, 8 different battleships were either sunk or severely damaged at that point, which is the majority of our kind of massive striking force in the Pacific Fleet at that time. Additionally, over 2,000 sailors lost their lives that day. Almost 200 aircraft were destroyed on the island as well. I mean, it was just a massive tragedy for the Americans. And we actually have a newspaper here from the day after that is announcing it. Japan declares war, Honolulu is attacked. And so this is out of Arizona, but after the attack, I mean, news traveled fast and the American people had a strong response to it naturally, right?
Yeah, there was a strong response. I mean, this, as the president said, this is a day that'll live in infamy. We've already had a world war going for the previous 2 years, starting back in 1939 as Hitler starts expanding across Europe. We've tried to stay out of it. You have all the expansion of Japan and the Pacific area, what they're doing with Manchuria, what they're doing with China. So there's conflict going across the globe at the time, and we're trying to stay neutral. And as a neutral power, we are now hit right in the teeth with a treacherous attack. We had done nothing to provoke it, and they've come after us, and as you point out, they destroyed most of the Pacific Fleet. If there was any good news to this, it was that our aircraft carriers were not there when it was attacked. They were supposed to be, but providentially they were elsewhere. So over the next 4 days after this attack, you actually have 6 declarations of war. Because when we were attacked, no war had been declared against us yet. We were still somewhat peaceful, if you will, quasi-belligerents. I mean, we were trying to stay out of it. We didn't agree with what Japan was doing, but once they hit us, they said, by the way, we declare war on you. And we said, well, we declare war on you too. And then Hitler said, well, if you're going after my friends in Japan, Tojo, then I'm declaring war on America as well. Great, we'll declare war on you. And then here came Mussolini with his declaration of war against America and ours against him. So in a matter of 4 days, there are 6 declarations of war. It literally now is a world war because America's been drawn into it in a very rapid way. We weren't ready for it. We still were flying World War I biplanes in the Air Force. We were still using World War I destroyers. We had tried to be neutral and we weren't ready for this. And what happened was we were so unprepared for this, and after having destroyed our Navy, we couldn't do much. So we put all of our attention really over on the European side and fighting Germany and what was happening there, trying to rebuild our Navy, rebuild our Air Force. We actually, on WallBuilders Live, which we do every day, we try to have World War II veterans on once a month or so. And I remember having a World War II veteran on. He literally was an 18-year-old at the time of the war. He was flying a B-24 bomber, the crew of 10, and at 18 years old, he was in charge of the whole crew. He said they had a 22-year-old that served with them on the plane, and they all called him Pops because he was so old at 22. And he talked about how that this plane came back and he had 107 holes in the plane when he landed. He'd been in the middle of war. And he said that American production at that time was so amazing that out of Detroit, they were turning out a B-24 bomber every 55 minutes off the assembly lines and turning out a new Liberty ship in the assembly ports every 4 days. So we weren't ready for this, but it took us a while to come back. And by the way, can I make a commentary that we can turn out a bomber in 55 minutes, a Liberty ship in 4 days, and we can't get a silly website up on healthcare in 3 years? You know, that's American technology. Nonetheless, it was something that changed us. So we put our attention over on Europe, and this is where the American military learned that, you know, you need to be able to fight a war on 2 fronts, which is a position we hold today. We could fight Hitler, but we couldn't fight Hitler and Japan. And so that's why we really had to finish off the war in Europe before we could turn attention to Japan. but it did start here.
Yeah, and even going back to that day, another one of the cool artifacts we have is actually the orders of the day for one of the ships stationed in Pearl Harbor. This is specifically for the USS California, but what's fascinating is it was Sunday, right? Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941 was a Sunday, and so all of these orders have to deal with, you know, the order of service for the various different denominations which are going to be holding church on board the ship. But the Japanese attack starts anywhere from it's around 750, 755 is when the first bombs are thought to have dropped, which is, if we look at the order of the day, is right when the USS California was sending a boat to shore in order to pick up their chaplain and bring him back for Bible study. And obviously throughout the war, religion was a huge part of what kind of motivated a lot of our soldiers, sailors, servicemen, and even the people back home. Religion was vital for the American war effort. We actually have some of the Bibles that were given out to the troops.
Yeah, after Pearl Harbor, the pictures of Americans flooding to the recruiting areas to say, I'm going to volunteer. Nobody's going to do this. I'm going to defend our nation. And so the lines, they go blocks long in some of the pictures. And part of the preparation, getting these guys ready for war, was spiritual preparation. And so this is an example of a Bible that was given to all the soldiers back then. Inside it has a note from President Franklin Roosevelt. And by the way, Franklin Roosevelt, in telling Congress about what's happened while we're now at war, as you listen, 4 weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Franklin Roosevelt told Congress, he said, look what we've got here. It really is a spiritual situation. He said what we're facing in Europe, for example, is God versus Hitler. It's Mein Kampf versus the Bible. It's the cross of Christ and the cross of mercy versus the swastika and the naked sword. That's the rhetoric of the President of the United States, that this is a spiritual conflict going here between two worldviews. And so he was very grounded in that sense of recognizing God. And so what he has in the front of this Bible is, it's a word to the soldier, sailor, and airman that you need to be in God's Word. This is what you've got to have. And it's interesting with what you mentioned, the orders from the California. You look inside this blue cover, this is what went to the sailors. This is the Bible that was given to the guys enlisted in the Navy. And on the inside, it actually has a Christian flag flying higher than the American flag, which seems a little strange in flag protocol today. A lot of people would probably object, except even in flag protocol today, the flag protocol says that the flag that calls you to service of God, calls you to divine service, is always to fly higher than the American flag. And so as that launch was going in to pick up the chaplain to bring him back to the ship, as soon as he got there and as soon as they would have started service, they would have raised that Christian flag above the American flag. And there's actually footage you can see of those flags in World War II with the Christian flag flying higher. And twice a day on naval ships you would have divine service. And so that's when it flew higher.
Yeah, another one of the cool Bibles that we have from World War II is this one right here. Now you can kind of see and listen, that's got a steel plate on the front of it, and it's actually engraven with the words, "May this keep you safe from harm." This is called a Heart Shield Bible because the idea was that you would drop this into your front pocket, kind of roughly in front of your heart, and this steel plate would be enough to actually stop a bullet. And from the stories, and we've actually had guys in this museum who have said, that actually saved my life back in the war. It actually was able to stop bullets, this Heart Shield Bible, but it's kind of got a double meaning there, right? If you read it, it's going to keep you safe from harm spiritually, but also if you keep it on you, it very well might save your life. In fact, we actually have stories going all the way back to the Revolutionary War of soldiers having their lives saved because the Bible took a bullet for them, which is very interesting.
And with the spiritual emphasis there, also one thing to recognize is obviously America ended up winning World War II with the Allies in Europe, after Europe and D-Day, and we got Hitler surrendered. We turned toward the Pacific and we got Japan subdued. And once Japan was subdued, MacArthur, who had been out in the Philippines, and the Philippines were attacked on the same day that Pearl Harbor was, because the Philippines, that was an American territory. We had large naval facilities there, a large air corps there. They were destroyed on the same day Pearl Harbor was. But MacArthur is out there and he oversees really the battle in the Pacific area. And after Japan finally surrenders, he's put in charge of reconstruction. And it's interesting that one of the things that MacArthur said was, look, if we're going to rebuild Japan, They have such a different culture. They have a death-oriented kind of culture. You honor your ancestors by who you can kill and how many you can kill, and suicide is an acceptable part of their culture. He said, if we're going to change this, the first thing we need is missionaries. So he asked for 5,000 missionaries to be sent to Japan. He asked for Bibles to be imported, and it's interesting, after he started the spiritual rebuilding in Japan, and Japan by no way is a Christian nation today, it's still only about 3% Christian, but the teachings of the Bible changed their thinking to such a degree that within only 7 years they had been accepted back into the nations of the world as a civilized nation. And strikingly, crusades were held during that time. Billy Graham went there and did crusades. And the guy who had been the leader of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the captain who led the entire attack on Pearl Harbor, became a Christian in Japan. And one of the guys who was, after Pearl Harbor attack, we wanted the Japanese to know that, look, we have to deal with Hitler, but we haven't forgotten you. So we had what was called the Doolittle Raid, where that General Doolittle took just a handful of bombers and bombed Tokyo just within weeks of Pearl Harbor, just to say, we're still here. So one of those raiders, Doolittle raiders, his plane was shot down. He was captured. He was put in a prisoner of war camp. He was tortured, and actually found a Bible in that prisoner of war camp. He came to Christ, and he went from bitter hatred of the Japanese to a love of the Japanese. And so after the war and that Reconstruction time, now you have the leader of the Japanese force who attacked Pearl Harbor, who joined with one of the Doolittle raiders, and these two Christian guys held crusades in Japan and crusades in America as well. So a lot of spiritual stuff came out of that. The Bible is just a reflection of that, but there's a lot of good accounts of that as well.
And so this year, which is the 80th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, it's vital that we remember our history, remember the sacrifice of the sailors who died that day, and also remember the efforts of the American people afterwards, where we kind of joined together and covenant again our lives, fortune, and sacred honor to push back this tyranny, both in Europe and in the Pacific. But this is a story that's actually not being taught in schools anymore.
Yeah.
The story of Pearl Harbor is being left out. I remember in the 2014 AP U.S. History Standards, they took out any mention of Pearl Harbor at all. And I know in Minnesota, they took it out as well. I mean, you can't...
Yeah, in Minnesota, referring to Minnesota, it's one of the many states this year that said, you know, we've decided a new look at American history. We're not going to teach the American Revolution or the Civil War or World War I or World War II or the Holocaust. So for the next 10 years in states like Minnesota, you won't hear anything about World War II, which means you're especially not going to hear about the attack on Pearl Harbor.
So this year, as we are, remembering the 80th anniversary of it, be sure that you're sharing this story, or you're asking the people around you, making sure that they remember this day, because it's vital to understanding our national history, our national character, and remembering what's really important and what's necessary for all Americans to do whenever the need arises of standing up and defending our liberties, defending our freedom. There was actually a speech that FDR gave a week after Pearl Harbor. It was over the radio to the entire American people, and it was very powerful, and he closed with this thought that I'd like to share. He says, we, Americans, we covenant with each other before all the world that having taken up arms in the defense of liberty, we will not lay them down before liberty is once again secure in the world we live in. For that security we pray. For that security we act, now and evermore. And I just think that's a very powerful sentiment, and something that we need to remember this year on the 80th anniversary of the attacks, and something that we should probably emulate in our own lives, that whenever we see tyranny, we need to make sure that we're standing up against it, speaking out against it, and remembering the examples of those who came before us. And so, if you want to learn more about American history and Pearl Harbor, or really any aspect of our nation's past, you can find out more on WallBuilders.com, and definitely keep joining us for more episodes of One Room Schoolhouse.